Rachel.
Hey, Brittany.
So today I want to talk about, I geek out over a lot of history, but this is like one of my favorite things. It's my favorite document. If I was saying that, I can definitely say that for sure.
Is it the Constitution?
It is not the Constitution, but we would not have the Constitution without this.
Is it the Declaration of Independence?
No, but we also wouldn't have the Constitution. That's probably my second favorite, though. It is the Magna Carta, or the Great
Magna
Charter,
Carta.
or the Charter of Liberties. It has a few names, and there's some like lore around it that may or may not be completely accurate, but these are the stories that are passed down. So the Magna Carta, what is it? Well, first of all, so our declaration, that's 1776. Right? We're going to go back in time from there to the year 1215. So
oh, wow.
way before,
I was not even born yet.
No, we were not born yet. So we're going way back in time for that. And let me explain to you what the systems were back then. So this was the feudal system. And in the feudal system, you had the king. And the king was, in his opinion, anointed by God, and he had full authority. And this is, let me also say, it's in Britain. So we are in Great Britain. So you have the king, and the king pretty much does whatever he wants. Now, the very, very start of property rights in this British common law, which we are part of, we'll get to that later, was the nobles, the land barons, okay? And the land barons were given land by the king. It was still the king's land, but they were basically, the king was like, you can borrow some land and hire some, serfs and villagers. Serfs are the people who worked the land. And you can be in charge of them, but it's still my land, and I'm still in charge of you, and I am going to charge you a tax. So you have to pay that tax. And where do you think the barons got their taxes? They would tax the people, right? So everybody's getting taxed, as always, right? What do they say?
There's only two things that are certain.
Death and taxes are the only two things that are certain. So This is happening, and it's working okay for the barons. Probably not so much if you're the serfs. Still kind of a hard life. But the barons are like, okay, it's okay. But then things start getting a little messed up. So the king sometimes just comes through town and takes whatever he wants. Sometimes that was food. Sometimes it was just random pieces of property. And remember, he still thinks it's his property. So he's not doing anything wrong in his mind. But the barons are getting a little angry about this because they're like, wait a second. How is this fair? We're doing everything that you told us to do. We're paying you your taxes. And now you're coming and you're stealing our food and you're doing all this. And we're just supposed to thank you for this land that you've let us use. So this goes back and forth. Not cool. Oh, there was more going on too. If a baron did something wrong, a lot of times they would be taken to like a king's, I don't want to call it a court in any semblance that there is today, but it was a court. It was still a court. But these were the king's judges, right? So a baron could get brought before a court, and they did whatever the king wanted them to do. So even though you'd think like, a judge is there to weigh the facts and choose. No. So basically it was what the king wants, the king gets. So you weren't getting a fair trial. Okay. You weren't getting
It's good to be king, though.
It's good to be king. It's always good to be king. You weren't getting a jury trial. You weren't getting a fair trial. Okay. You really didn't have any jurisdiction is a word for it, over your property, any dominion over your property, because it was the king's property. You didn't have a rule of law, which is very important. You didn't have consent of the governed. All these things that you've probably heard about when we talk about the revolution, okay, these are things that the barons are getting pretty upset about. So this is going back and forth, back and forth. So the barons are meeting and they're like, what are we going to do about this guy? Okay, this guy's out of control. He's not listening. He's stealing our food. We don't know what to do. And it's getting to the point where they're like, all right, something has to be done. So they draft this Magna Carta, this Charter of Liberties. And it is the first time in this British common law history that we have written down and recorded on paper a list of laws, a rule of law that the king or a leader was going to have to live by, that it wasn't the king's authority, but a rule of law, something higher than the king that he must abide by, that everyone had to abide by. And this is the first time you get things like property rights, okay, things like fair trial. These things didn't exist on paper before. They were ideas, they were thoughts, but they weren't on paper. But I told you about the king, Rachel. I told you he wasn't like the most easy guy to get along with, right? So he's not just going to be like, yeah, this this sounds like a great deal. Like, yeah, sure, sign me up, right? That's not what's going to happen here. Fun side note, if you grew up watching the Robin Hood with animals, the Disney one, the Prince George, or is it King? It's the King George.
Prince John?
Prince John, thank you. It's Prince John who is actually the king. That's who that character is based off of. There's other backstory there, but
not King Richard.
Not King Richard. It's King John or Prince John in the movie that was actually the one to sign the Magna Carta. Obviously, these are fictionalized. Robin Hood is not,
not really a lion or a fox.
That's technically who that was. So so that's a great movie though. I need to watch that again.
I love it. Yeah.
So here's where the lore, I say lore, kicks in, because this is like legend has it. We don't know exactly what conditions happen to make the king decide to sign it, but legend has it, and this is the story I'm going with. The king is like, all right, I'll go to your meeting, whatever. So he shows up. And does not expect that when he shows up, all the barons are there, just like waiting for him.
Staring him down.
Staring at him. Not only staring at him down, but sitting him down forcibly and all holding their swords basically to his throat, saying, you will read this and you will sign it. Now, I know there are two things that go through my head when I hear that. I think, like, isn't that force? Aren't we? Isn't that, not good.
But it sounds like self-defense, though.
But it's also at the time, yes, definitely self-defense. And they, John Locke, who came much later, he talked about this right to revolution, that there does come a time when if there's all these abuses of authority by the government, then you do have the right to say, no, we're going to take, our power back. And so obviously way before Locke, but that's essentially what was happening. The barons were like, this isn't going to happen anymore. You need to sign this. And there was actually a huge back and forth, because back then, part of the reason that we are so adamant on separation of church and state is because for so much of history, there wasn't. And so the king would influence the church and the church would influence the king and vice versa. And so they had this like ultimate authority, because imagine if you're the king and you don't want your authority questioned. So then you have a church official say, well, God said to obey the king. It's a great scam. I mean, it's a great scam if you're looking for people to obey you. And these are corrupt church officials. I'm not saying, religion. Right. I'm just saying. So at the time,
just say, God told me to tell you such and such. Exactly. That's a great scam. Potentially, if you're an evil person.
Yeah. For something to be official back in these times, you had to have not only the king's signature, but a church seal, the Catholic Church seal. So there was like some back and forth of like, okay, but he didn't get the seal. Okay, but then they did get the seal. But then did they really meet? So there's this whole back and forth. And the Magna Carta did not make everything airtight. There would be back and forth on the kings and the barons. But the Magna Carta was of significance because it was the first time, like I said, that they got it on paper. It was the first time that these rights were talked about. And I only listed a few, so for your homework assignment, please, go out and I want you to research more. But the Magna Carta and what it symbolized, this was a piece of paper. Actually, it was 4 pieces. Technically, there's 4 different copies, but I thought there was one. I was very excited I was going to get to see it when I go to England in a couple of weeks. And then I found out there's like 4 of them. And I'm like, that doesn't count. So technically he had to sign 4 different documents, but we'll call it one.
Wow.
So this is something that inspired the founders. This is what things that inspired, John Locke, the people that came right before the founders in England. And again, I mentioned earlier, like, why does it matter this happened in England? We're not England. We fought a whole war against that. But the reason we fought that war, many reasons, but one of them was because there was British common law that said the king is not above the law. Now, the king did not always obey that, but especially when it came to the colonies, the king was like, you guys are barely people. I don't have to pay attention to this, right? And we were upset. Mm-hmm. That's why there was the list of grievances. We were saying, like, you're refusing to do this. You're not giving us jury trials. You're not doing this. They didn't just make that up. That didn't come out of thin air. These were things that were already put in place that the king was just like, nah, I don't want to. I don't feel like it today. So all of this stems back to the Magna Carta, which I think is just so important and so fun. But one thing I do want to point out, because I love to be like, oh, this was a great moment for individual liberty, for property rights, and it was. But I do also want to point out that it was a great time for property rights for a very select few. The serfs could not own property. So this was great. It was a step in the right direction, but there's still this whole feudal system where people are not allowed to hold property and they don't have rights. If you think the barons weren't getting their rights, imagine if you're a serf, right? Like you're right. Like I said, your life is not going super well. But it laid that foundation. You know, it started with that property holders get rights, and it eventually trickled down to every person who is born with, you know, inalienable rights. And we've all heard that part of the Declaration before. So it's, to me, I actually get, my boyfriend makes fun of me because whenever we go to the Library of Congress and I see Thomas Jefferson's collections of books, I get very emotional. Or I see the Declaration in the archives. So the Magna Carta, even just talking about it, just like lights me up and I get a little emotional because it's so important to every single one of our individual rights that wouldn't, I mean, they exist, right? They don't exist because of government. They don't exist because of a piece of paper. But that piece of paper was so powerful in altering the course of human history and reining in the power of kings and getting us out of a monarchy, even though I think the clothes were kind of cool. Like, I wouldn't want to live under a monarchy, but I wouldn't say no to a crown or a big fancy dress or like the big tall hair they had in France. But so Magna Carta is just, it's one of my favorite things because I think it did lay the groundwork for everything we're trying to protect today. So,
and like you say, it wasn't perfect for everybody, but definitely an improvement over the king owning everything to sharing property rights with a whole other group of people. Even if it's not everybody yet, we kind of have to wait until we get to the Enlightenment period for those kinds of radical property rights.
Well, and then even, let's be honest, civil rights stuff, right? There's always been a struggle for individual liberty, and that has trickled down to all people. So even, you know.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't until like the 60s or 70s, like the 1960s, 1970s, where women could open a bank account.
Oh, have a credit card, which is crazy to me.
Without a male cosigner, like a father or a husband cosigning.
This is getting sidetracked for a minute, but there's a show I love, Downton Abbey. I think a lot of moms probably love this show.
I love that show.
The whole premise of the show is that they have to find a male heir because even though there's a daughter who was going to inherit the property, she wasn't allowed to because back in the early 1900s, 1900s, women couldn't have property. So it was a big thing. So it's taken a while. Like you said, it's not perfect, but you know.
It was a huge step in codifying rights in the right direction. So awesome. We will Thanks for that,
wrap it up there.
Brittany.
Yeah, no, like I said, I could talk about it forever and ever. It's one of my favorite things. But yes, thanks, guys. So we'll wrap it up there. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast. And until next time, we will talk to you later.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.